My name is Amina Thompson, and I never imagined that a single conversation could push me to the brink of questioning everything I believed in. That night, sitting across from my father at the dinner table, I felt something inside me snap. "You still believe in that?" His voice was laced with disappointment, his eyes piercing into mine. A God who watched our ancestors suffer? Who let them beg for freedom while their oppressors called on the same God for strength? I wanted to argue, to defend my faith, but I couldn't ignore the weight of his words. I had wrestled with these questions my entire life. Born into a deeply religious Black family in the South, I was raised on gospel hymns, Sunday sermons, and the belief that God had a plan for everything. But as I got older, history's evidence made me doubt. I had read the slave narratives. I had seen the photographs of lynchings where men, women, and children hung from trees while crowds stood by, laughing. I had studied the laws that had been written to keep us in chains, some physical, some economic, some psychological. And through it all, those in power had held up the Bible, claiming divine justification for it all. And yet, my grandmother had prayed to this same God. My mother had clung to her faith like it was the only thing holding her together. I had seen women in our church fall to their knees, crying out for justice, for healing, for peace. But had he ever answered? Or had we just convinced ourselves that he had? The questions had always lingered at the back of my mind. But that night, my father's words dragged them to the surface. That night, something inside me broke. "Maybe you're right," I muttered, pushing away my plate. "Maybe I've just been lying to myself." The look on my father's face was unreadable, but I didn't stay long enough to hear what he had to say next. I grabbed my keys and stormed out the door, the thick Georgia air wrapping around me as I stepped into the night. I didn't have a destination, just a need to get away. I drove aimlessly, my mind spinning. Maybe my father was right. Maybe I had spent my whole life believing in something that was never there. Rain started to drizzle, blurring the streetlights. I barely noticed. My thoughts were too loud, drowning out everything else. Then, out of nowhere, headlights, a blinding flash, the sound of metal twisting, the unbearable force of impact. Everything went black. Silence. A deep, suffocating silence. Then, awareness. I wasn't in my car anymore. I wasn't anywhere. No pain, no sound, just existence. My mind felt clear, sharper than it ever had before, but something was terribly wrong. I blinked. Or at least I thought I did. In an instant, I saw the wreckage below me, the crushed frame of my car, the windshield shattered into a spiderweb of glass, steam rising from the twisted metal. A crowd had gathered. Sirens wailed in the distance, and there I was. My body, limp against the deflated airbag, blood dripping from my forehead. I should have panicked, but I didn't. Instead, an eerie calm settled over me as I hovered above the scene. It was as if I had stepped outside of time itself. A paramedic rushed to my car, prying open the door. "She's unresponsive!" he shouted. More hands joined in, pulling my body onto a stretcher. The flashing red and blue lights painted the night in a chaotic swirl of color. I wanted to scream, to tell them I was right here, watching, that I wasn't gone. But no sound came from me. It was as if I didn't belong to that world anymore. Then, I felt it. A force, gentle yet overwhelming, pulling me upward. I turned, and what I saw next sent a wave of confusion through me. A tunnel of light. But not just any light. It was alive, pulsating with warmth, stretching endlessly into the heavens. The sight was so overwhelming, so impossible, that for the first time fear crept in. I looked down one last time, The paramedics were still working on me, their voices urgent, desperate. I saw the driver of the other car, his hands on his head, his body trembling as he sobbed. Then the pull became stronger. I had no choice, no resistance, no understanding of what was happening. And then everything around me disappeared. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no form, no sensation. It was like stepping into the space between existence and the unknown. My mind grasped for something familiar, but there was nothing to hold on to. No gravity, no body, just a vast, endless expanse of something. Then, a warmth. It started as a whisper against my skin, or at least where my skin should have been. A gentle hum, a vibration that didn't come from outside but resonated from within me. It was soft, almost like a song being sung just beneath the threshold of hearing. And then the light returned. It wasn't harsh like the glare of the sun, nor was it distant like the moon. This light was alive, moving, shifting like waves in an ocean, swirling around me with a presence that was both overwhelming and deeply familiar. It wrapped around me, not consuming me, but holding me. I had no words for it. It wasn't fire, yet it burned away every fear, every doubt. It wasn't air, yet I felt like I was breathing it in, as if I had never truly taken a breath until now. Slowly, my senses adjusted, and I realized I was moving, not by my own will, but being guided. Pulled forward, upward, inward, I couldn't tell which. The tunnel of light I had seen before was no longer just a distant phenomenon. It surrounded me now, vast and endless. Colors I had no names for danced along its walls, blending and shifting like living water. I reached out instinctively, but my hands weren't there. I should have been afraid. But I wasn't. Because someone was here. At first, it was just a presence, a knowing, a force that seemed to see through every layer of me. It wasn't oppressive. It wasn't judging. It was just aware of me, of everything I'd ever been, every thought I had ever had. And yet, I felt no shame. Then, the presence spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in something deeper, a voice that bypassed my ears and settled directly into my soul. Amina. I knew that voice. I had never heard it before, but I had known it forever. It carried weight, not just authority, but intimacy. It was the voice of someone who had known me before I was even formed, who had walked with me, even in the moments I thought I was alone. You have questions. Tears welled in my eyes. If I even had eyes in this form, I felt myself tremble, though I had no body. Why do you see us? The words came before I could stop them. They weren't spoken aloud, but they were heard. Why do you let us suffer? There was no anger in my voice now, only a raw, aching desperation that had lived inside me for years. The presence moved closer, and suddenly, I could see him. He wasn't standing before me. He wasn't towering over me like I had imagined God would. Instead, he was everywhere, woven into the very fabric of the light. And yet, somehow, I could still focus on him as if all of creation bent to make him the center. Jesus. I had seen depictions of him all my life. The paintings, the sculptures, the stories. None of them had prepared me for this. His face wasn't just radiant, it was alive. It held depth beyond time itself. His eyes weren't just eyes, they were oceans of understanding, filled with every sorrow and every joy that had ever existed. He wasn't just beautiful, he was beauty itself. And yet, his presence wasn't overwhelming in the way I thought it might be. It was safe. Come. Without walking, without effort, I was drawn closer. I felt no distance between us, no barrier. I was bare before him, every thought, every wound, every question. You think I have been silent. His voice held no accusation, only a deep sorrow that made my soul ache. You believe I have turned my face away. I had no response, because he was right. You do not yet understand how I see my children. And then I saw it. A vision unfolded before me, wrapping around my senses like a story written into the air itself. I saw chains, millions of them, stretching through history, shackles of oppression, of pain, of injustice. I saw my ancestors, their hands bound, their backs bruised, their eyes searching for the sky, calling out to a God who seemed absent. I felt their prayers, their tears sinking into the earth. But then I saw him, not watching from a distance. Walking among them, I saw Jesus stepping into their suffering. I saw him kneel beside a woman whose child had been torn from her arms, whispering comfort only her soul could hear. I saw him guiding the hands of those who resisted oppression, strengthening them in moments when they thought they had none left. I saw him weeping, not in powerlessness, but in a grief that bore their pain as his own. I was never absent. His voice broke through my soul like thunder. I was in the cries, I was in the fight, I was in the moments of hope, the moments of courage. I have never left my people. Tears, real tears, ran down my face, because I knew it was true. Then why? I choked out. Why did you let it happen at all? The vision shifted. I saw history moving, flowing like a great river. I saw the rise and fall of empires, the shifting of power, the weight of choices across generations. And then I saw something I had never considered. I saw inheritance, not wealth, not status. Spiritual inheritance. The prayers of your ancestors did not fall into the void. Jesus' voice was firm now. They planted seeds in the spirit. They fought wars that were not just physical, but eternal. And because of them, he looked at me, through me. You stand in a strength that is greater than you know. I saw it now. I saw the legacy of faith, of endurance, of an unbreakable spirit that had been forged in the very fires of suffering. It wasn't just history. It was purpose. It was destiny. The suffering of this world was never my design, but neither is it wasted. What was meant for destruction, I have turned into a foundation. And then he showed me a future. A vision so vast I could barely comprehend it. I saw a people rising, stepping into the fullness of who they were meant to be. Not just survivors, leaders, not just the oppressed, warriors. A generation walking in a power that had been cultivated through centuries of prayer, of endurance, of faith that had never truly died. But something wasn't complete. Something was still missing. The light around me pulsed, and I felt a tension. A moment on the edge of something even greater. Do you see now? Jesus asked. His voice was filled with something fierce, something urgent. This is not just history. This is not just pain. This is power. I wanted to answer. I wanted to say I understood, but I wasn't sure I did, not yet. And that's when everything shifted. The vision around me trembled, like ripples in water after a stone is cast into its depths. I felt something pressing against me, not physically, but a force, an urgency, as if the very air around me was waiting for something to break. Jesus' eyes held mine, and in that moment, I knew. I was on the edge of something vast, something I wasn't sure I was ready to see. Look again, he commanded, his voice both gentle and unshakable. And then the vision expanded. Before me, time unraveled. I saw faces upon faces, millions of souls stretching across history. I saw the cries of the enslaved, their voices rising like incense to the heavens. I saw warriors who had fought for freedom, mothers who had whispered scripture over their children in the dead of night, prophets who had spoken words that nations refused to hear. Then I saw the unseen. The battles that had raged beyond the physical world, forces of darkness pressing down, trying to smother, trying to silence. And yet, the more oppression tightened its grip, the more faith burned. I saw angels, thousands, standing in the shadows of history, fighting alongside those who had been called weak. I saw chains breaking not just in the natural, but in the spirit. And I saw him, Jesus, walking among them, not watching from a distance, not seated in some faraway throne, but moving within the very midst of suffering. He stood beside those being beaten, feeling every lash as though it struck his own back. He held the hands of those in despair, his tears falling into their wounds. I saw him whisper courage into those who thought their struggle was meaningless, infusing them with power beyond their own. I was never silent, he said, his voice filled with something deeper than sorrow, something fierce. I have always been fighting. I have always been present. And yet, despite it all, I still felt a weight inside me, a question that had not yet been answered. Then why do we still suffer? My voice trembled. If you have always been with us, why does it never stop? The vision changed again. I was no longer looking at the past. Now I saw the present, the world as it was right now. I saw the oppression that still lingered, the injustices that had evolved instead of disappearing. I saw my own people still crying out, still searching, still waiting. And then I saw us. A generation standing at a crossroads. Some were awake, eyes burning with understanding, their hands reaching for something greater. But others were distracted, consumed by illusions of power and validation that could never fill them. And I saw something terrifying, a great darkness creeping closer. A force that had always been there, but now it was moving faster, more aggressively, unrestrained. Because the battle is not over, Jesus said, his voice like thunder now. Because my people have forgotten who they are. Suddenly, I saw myself. Not just me, but all of us. Those who had carried the legacy of faith, who had inherited the prayers and sacrifices of those before us. I saw chains still hanging from many of us, not because they had not been broken, but because we still held on to them. They have been freed, but they still walk as though they are bound, Jesus said, his eyes piercing into my soul. They have power, but they do not use it. They have my voice, but they have stopped listening. My breath caught, because I knew he was right. I had spent my whole life questioning, doubting, demanding to know where God had been in history. But I had never asked myself where we had been. I had never asked why we were still waiting for permission to step into the power that was already ours. The ground beneath me trembled. The light around me pulsed. Something was happening. The time of waiting is over, Jesus declared, his voice shaking the very fabric of this place. The world is shifting. The war is not coming. It is already here. And my people must choose. I could feel it now, this overwhelming force pressing against my spirit, demanding something from me. It was as if the weight of every prayer, every sacrifice, every fight for justice had been placed into my hands. You must choose, Amina. The moment his words hit me, I felt everything. I felt the fire of those who had fought before me. I felt the prayers of my ancestors surging through my veins. I felt the power that had always been there, waiting for someone, for me, to pick it up. "What am I supposed to do?" I whispered. Jesus stepped closer. His presence wrapped around me, not just in comfort, but in power. "You already know," he said. "I have placed it inside you from the beginning. The question is not what you must do. The question is, will you finally step into it?" And then the light around me exploded. I was no longer just watching the vision, I was inside it. I saw my people rising. I saw voices speaking with a power that shattered deception. I saw chains falling as truth spread like wildfire. I saw warriors stepping onto the battlefield, not with weapons of the world, but with authority that no force of darkness could stand against. I saw us, fully awakened, and I felt it. The call, the power, the responsibility. "The choice is yours," Jesus' voice echoed all around me, resonating through every part of my being. I wasn't ready. I was terrified. But I knew this was it. Everything in my life, everything in my bloodline, everything in history had led to this moment, and I had to answer. The choice was mine. The weight of it pressed against me, urgent and inescapable. Jesus' words still echoed in the vastness around me, resonating deep within my soul. Would I step into what had always been mine? For a moment, I hesitated. Not because I doubted him, but because I doubted myself. What if I fail? The thought was barely formed before he answered. "You were never meant to do this alone." His voice was steady, unshaken, as if my fear was insignificant compared to the power that had already been set in motion. And then, suddenly, I was falling. The light around me fractured, folding into itself. The vision of warriors, of chains breaking, of a people rising, it didn't disappear. It moved inside me. It burned itself into my very being, like fire running through my veins. Then, impact. I gasped, air rushing into my lungs. A blinding white ceiling came into view, harsh hospital lights flickering above me. My chest heaved, and I felt the weight of a body I hadn't realized I'd left behind. Machines beeped frantically around me, and the muffled sound of voices filled the room. "She's back!" someone shouted. Hands were on me, medical staff, their faces frozen in shock. I turned my head slightly, my body aching, my limbs trembling, and then I saw him, the driver. The man who had hit me sat in the corner of the room, his hands gripping his hair, his body shaking. He looked broken, crushed by guilt, by fear. His eyes met mine, and I saw it immediately. Shame. Hopelessness. The very chains I had just seen in my vision wrapped around him now, unseen to the others in the room, but painfully visible to me. I knew in that moment what I had to do. With every ounce of strength I had, I lifted my hand toward him, his breath hitched, his body going still. "You're forgiven." The words left my lips before I had a chance to think, but I meant them. And as soon as I spoke them, I saw something shift in his eyes, like a door had been cracked open in a place that had been locked for far too long. This was it. This was the beginning. I wasn't just back. I had returned with purpose.